Hello YouTube. Tamriel has had many emperors, from wise and long-lived emperors like Uriel Septim VII to warrior emperors like Uriel V, and emperors who wanted to do nothing but party all the time and leave the ruling business to others like Brasileus Dor. But there's one emperor who consistently ranks in my top 5 of most interesting emperors, and that's the Mad Emperor, Pelagius III. And today I want to explore the story of the Mad Emperor after the intro. So, Pelagius Septim III, or Pelagius Septim the Mad, as he has become known over the years. He was an emperor of the Septim Empire in the middle of the Third Era, ruling about 480 years before the events of Skyrim. His story is both quite funny and also quite tragic, and to an extent likely a bit over-dramatized, as the legends of his madness and the silly acts of the crazy emperor have cemented itself heavily into folk legend and is a favorite of people to recount. And as such, some of the stories of his madness may have been dramatized a bit over the years. Now, that having been said, we definitely know that Pelagius III was insane. While some of the stories of his madness may have been a little over-exaggerated or made up by gossipy nobles, we do know that the story is true, at least in broad strokes. So, let's start at the beginning of what we know. Pelagius Septim III, or Taurus Pelagius Septim as his birth name was born in the year 119 of the Third Era. He was, for all terms and purposes, described as a pretty normal child, and as he grew up into a young adult, there was nothing that really indicated that this man would later become one of the most infamous emperors of all time. In fact, in his youth, he was described as a handsome, personable boy with a wide range of interests, with a bright future ahead of him as likely a future king or a diplomat. And I say not emperor, as initially there was no indication that he would ever become emperor. You see, at the time of his birth he was at the very least 9th to the throne, as his father was one of the younger children of the late emperor Pelagius II. And for Taurus Pelagius to ever ascend to the throne, at least 2 uncles, 1 aunt, more than 3 cousins, and his father would all have to die without getting any additional children for him to land on the throne. So, in times of peace, it was quite unlikely for him to ever become emperor. However, Taurus Pelagius had the misfortune to be born just 2 years before the most devastating civil war that the Septim Empire had ever seen, the War of the Red Diamond, which started when his eldest uncle, Emperor Antiochus Septim, died. Now, the death of the emperor created a succession crisis in which his 2 cousins, Quintera Septim, the daughter of Antiochus, the previous emperor, and Uriel Septim III, the son of Taurus Pelagius' aunt, Potema, fought a civil war to become the leader of Tamriel. Both of these cousins, however, died during the civil war, after which his other uncle, Severus Septim, took the throne, and his aunt, Potema Septim, would keep on fighting an ever more desperate civil war against the Empire from Solitude in Skyrim, where she eventually resorted to employing undead armies to fight her brother's Imperial legions. This siege of Solitude took extremely long, as Potema had dug herself into the city for 10 years and used her undead hordes to defend the city. In fact, the siege took so long that Taurus Pelagius would come of age and serve his uncle the Emperor in the army that ended up defeating Potema's undead hordes, and that would end up recapturing Solitude. Now, out of gratitude for the defeat of his aunt and the capture of Solitude, Taurus Pelagius was made King of Solitude by his uncle the Emperor when he was 18 years old, as at that time, before Skyrim's reorganization into one kingdom with Jarls and one High King, Solitude was its own vassal kingdom of the Empire, and Taurus Pelagius, the later Pelagius the Mad, became the king of that kingdom. Now, as King of Solitude, his madness first started to establish himself. To many it became clear that our once handsome and personable young prince had eccentricities, and these eccentricities turned to outright acts of madness over the years. According to the book The Madness of Pelagius, it all started with the king having sudden and strange shifts in his body weight, with some diplomats describing him as a jolly fat man, while less than half a year later he was described as an almost skeleton-like bony man. Then his behavior also started to become erratic. He apparently locked the princes and princesses of another kingdom with him in his room during some state visit. He tore off his clothes during a speech to the public, which resulted in his royal advisors and members of the court starting to keep him under a very close watch and likely limiting his public appearances, likely hoping that his madness would lessen over the years. But if that was their hope, They would be very disappointed, as Pelagius' mental condition over the years would become worse and worse and would become harder to keep secret, as his madness and eccentric behavior quickly became infamous in noble circles. Even his father, who had become Emperor Magnus Septim after Sepphoris died childless, seemed to have noticed, as he married Pelagius off in a political marriage to the influential Dark Elf Duchess Kataraya Ra Atim, who was known as a very clever diplomat, strong personality and a great beauty, likely hoping that Kataraya would be able to hide the madness of her future husband behind her competence and perhaps steer him off the path of madness, while also repairing some relations with Morrowind by having her enter the Imperial family. But even Kataraya could not prevent the Emperor from descending deeper into madness, and the nobility must have collectively braced itself when the news came that Emperor Magnus died and that Pelagius was still his heir, meaning that he would have to go to the Imperial city and be crowned Emperor. Just to be clear, he actually had a sister, so he could have been disowned, but he wasn't before his father died. This then also led to some conspiracies that Pelagius may have had a hand in the death of his father, as, you know, maybe his father would want to disown him at some point, but there's no real evidence for that. Now, there's many legends of his time as Emperor Pelagius III or Pelagius the Mad, which, like I said at the start of this video, may be slightly overblown. But the stories that we do have are definitely funny, true or not, because we know that there's a story about him literally fainting during his coronation and Kataraya having to hold him up so that nobody would notice that he fainted except for the guards and nobles who stood closest. There's also a legend about him insisting that he wanted to talk to an Argonian ambassador in his own language, the language Gel, but instead of learning this language, which is already nearly impossible for regular humans or elves, he just insulted the ambassador by making random squeaking and grunting sounds which he thought was Gel. He apparently also tried hanging himself during a ball. He pooped on the floors to quote-unquote give the palace staff something to do in cleaning it up, as he always demanded super clean spaces. And that also led to calling in the staff at really random times, even in the very early morning, to clean everything. And he apparently started to bite and attack palace visitors after some time. Now, during this time, you have to understand that Pelagius already did not rule the empire. His wife Kataraya, together with the Elder Council, ruled the empire. Pelagius was just a figurehead, and they tried what they could to hide his weird behavior from the public. However, when he started to attack the people who actually met him, they gave up, and Pelagius was sent to some quote-unquote vacation palaces in far-flung regions of the empire, where he rarely left. In fact, these palaces were different insane asylums, where he often either had his own completely private asylum or complete wings of established high-end asylums to himself. Inside these asylums, the charade was kept up to him that he was the emperor and that he was just merely on retreat or vacation, with him even attempting to speak to the people who tried visiting him. He apparently chewed on slippers, ordering random executions, and apparently tried to organize a ball to which no one showed up because another patient stole all the invitations. However, in the meantime, his wife Kataraya just became empress in all but name, and after one visit to his insane asylum, after which she conveniently became pregnant with his child, it's said that the two rarely saw each other, as Pelagius was transferred between asylums quite often, and Kataraya had an empire to rule. Funnily enough, at the time there were rumors that he was actually just sane and pretty clever, but that it was all just one big conspiracy to put his wife on the throne, and all the outlandish stories were just fabricated by her. However, Skyrim did give us the answer that Pelagius was definitely mad during the Sheogorath quest. Now, eventually on a hot summer night, Pelagius caught a fever and died in his asylum cell at the Temple of Kinnereth on the Isle of Bethany, after which his wife officially became empress. Funnily enough, Sheogorath tells us that on his deathbed the emperor also tried to outlaw death, which would be funny if it's true. Now, in the wake of his death, the anniversary of his death in many parts of Tamriel would become known as Mad Pelagius Day, a sort of Tamrielic white April Fools. And the stones of the temple that he died in would be carried to the Shivering Isles to rebuild it as a temple and a shrine to one of Tamriel's greatest madmen, which is actually pretty funny. Now, what can we make of Pelagius' madness? What caused it? Well, we don't know. An infamous Tamrielic legend is that his aunt Potema, during the siege of her city, snuck out of the palace in a disguise of an old woman and gave him a cursed necklace with a soul gem in it, which over time would drain his sanity to get revenge on her family. This would explain why his madness started just after Solitude fell, and the fact that the developers gave him this specific noble outfit in Skyrim, which features a necklace which kind of resembles the necklace from the story, instead of the Emperor's robes. that would also kind of point to this legend being true. The legend is known quite well across Tamriel, but it's also a highly unreliable, almost fictional story the way it's written. Now, another popular theory online is that Pelagius was just unfortunate enough to encounter Sheogorath somewhere around the time of his first coronation as King of Solitude, who probably thought that it would be funny to curse him, as, you know, cursing rulers always makes for good entertainment. However, there's also a possibility that his madness was just an unfortunate combination of circumstances. You see, we know that Pelagius' mother was quite a paranoid woman and instilled a deep fear of betrayal and danger into him, which led to a childhood filled with nightmares. And in addition, we know that during his early and later life, Pelagius actually really hated himself and had a very low self-confidence. Combine that with your childhood primarily taking place during a devastating civil war, even taking part in battles yourself during childhood, something which can rightfully be quite traumatic due to all the violence and loss of life, including people that you might have loved. And we have an unfortunate recipe for a really broken person that could only very much descend into madness. However, considering the severity of his eventual behavior and his mental and physical degradation, I mean, eventually his handwriting even became like a childlike scribble, and he would have random eruption of violence and crazy behaviors, I wouldn't be surprised if the Potema necklace story or the Sheogorath story has some grain of truth to it. But like I said at the start, it's also possible that with there being at least 200 years between his life and the earliest time that we can play after his death in the Elder Scrolls Arena, his life might have become a bit over-dramatized, but hey, who knows. This unreliable narrator is the beauty of the Elder Scrolls lore and makes it so endlessly fascinating, and it gave us this fascinating figure who was clearly inspired by real historical figures like Roman Emperor Caligula and the English King Henry VIII, who were also both highly promising figures in their youth and then later descended into alleged paranoia and madness, and who also, to be fair, were likely a bit less extreme than some of the stories and legends about them state in later years. Anyway, that's about all that I can say about the Mad Emperor Pelagius III, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and managed to learn something new about the Elder Scrolls lore. And if you did, why not give the video a like or one of those high boost things? It would really help out the channel. By the way, if you need a new notebook for, you know, lore notes or study notes, I happen to sell Imperial knowledge lore notebooks. Look, I'm doing things like this with it, but you can use it for normal notes or something else. Okay, mandatory March plug over. Look in the description or in the top comment for a link to the store. And now all that's left for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon supporters: Goblark, Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Volcure of Argonia, RB Dash, Lexicon, Polycom, Sir Otter, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Mike Willis, Dodo Komodo, James Lynch, Barademos, and Kalakranz. These people, along with all the amazing people on screen, are my Patreon supporters and my YouTube members, and they keep this channel alive. And for that, I am very grateful. Alright, see you in the next lore video. Bye bye.